Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. Continuing with our series, War and Peace in Jewish Tradition. So we're going to go through a lot of material tonight, more, I would say, on the general side than delving into all of the details of many of the things that we're going to be mentioning. But there is a flow here, as we've been discussing for, I think, 2.5 months now, issues of war and peace in Israel, in the world, and within each and every person. And the energies of war, as we said many times, can be extended just to the idea of struggle, confrontation, contention, battling. But there's all kinds of battles on a personal level, a communal level, a national level, a universal level. So we're going to start with something that it's somewhat controversial, and we have to be very, very careful with the ideas that I'm going to present now, but they're really, really important ideas. But we have to know that they can be easily misunderstood. And that is what we'll call the nature of our enemies. Where do our enemies come from? And so throughout the Torah, Kabbalah, Chassidut, especially in the Torah itself, there's a very, very strong idea that in a certain way, and this is, again, where we have to be very careful, we draw enemies upon ourselves through our actions. What's an example? In Parshat Ki Tavo, in the book of Devarim, and in fact, almost the whole book of Devarim repeats this theme over and over again. And in Ki Tavo, it says, if you listen to the words of God and you follow the Torah, there's a whole long list of blessings that will come to Israel. Just the highest, most beautiful blessings. And then it says, but if you don't listen to the words of God and you don't follow the Torah, what follows is perhaps one of the most difficult sections of the entire Torah, because there are 98, we'll use the word curses, 98 negative consequences of not listening to the Torah. And so throughout the book of Devarim, it's over and over again. If you listen to God, you follow the Torah, you do the mitzvot, you do chesed, you're moral, you're ethical, you set up a moral and ethical society, then no enemy can touch you. In fact, there will be no such thing as enemies. It's only when you don't follow the Torah. So this is a classic case of midah keneged midah, of measure for measure, of cause and effect. And these are the spiritual laws of the universe. And so when we have enemies, so we have to look very, very carefully at what is causing these enemies to come against us. Now, this is the part that is very, very fine line and can be misunderstood, because if we adopt this philosophy 100%, then there's no culpability for our enemies. It's like we're to blame. Whatever happens to us, whether it's Hamas, or it's the Nazis, or it's the Crusades, or it's the Inquisition. So we could say, well, because if we were doing what we were supposed to be doing, none of this would happen. But we know it's not that simple. In other words, in our present situation, it's not like Hamas is, the whole reality of Hamas is because we're not doing what we're supposed to do. Hamas has its own philosophy, has its own agenda, and it happens to be that its agenda is to destroy the state of Israel. And so we have to balance this idea where we have to take responsibility for any negativity that is coming towards us, and to know, though, that we're not completely responsible for the actions of others. So you can hear what a fine line this is. It's very, very subtle, and it can be very misunderstood. This would be the classic idea of blaming the victim in all kinds of cases where the victim is victimized, but there'll be a way to rationalize, well, the victim brought it down upon themselves. And we don't really accept that completely. But on a spiritual level, I'm going to quote two sources here, both from the Talmud. Because in the last few weeks, we talked a lot about Amalek and the energy of Amalek and the energy of our archetypal cardinal enemies. And we mentioned, I'll be more specific now, that Amalek comes from Esav. And specifically, Amalek comes from a union of the son of Esav and Timnah. Timnah was his concubine. And from that, it says in the Torah, Amalek was born. But the Talmud tells an incredible story. And it says that the tradition is that Timnah wanted to join the Jewish people. And she actually came to Avraham and wanted to connect to the Jewish people. Now, it's a very difficult story because Avraham is known as spreading the teachings of one God, of bringing everyone into his tent, of being completely open. He's in the middle of a vision of God, and he sees what he thinks are three pagans coming, and he interrupts his vision with God because God, I have to take care of these people. And so, but this is a Talmudic statement. So Timnah came and wanted to join the Jewish people, and Avram refused her. And so the sages said, she said to herself, if I can't be part of Avram, but at least I can be part of his family. And so she went to the family of Esav, and from that brought Amalek into the world. And so the sages said, look how careful you have to be to push someone away. It's like, it's a bit of a startling story. There's another one that was taken out of the Talmud by the censors, but the story, we know it because we have the censored parts of the Talmud. And this is a story of Yeshu. And Yeshu was a student of Torah, and he had his Rebbe, and it was, I believe, I'm not going to mention because I don't want to mention the wrong name. Anyways, they were in an inn, and the Rebbe said, of course, it was in Hebrew, said, what a beautiful inn this is. And Yeshu, because the words were very close, understood what he meant was the waitress. He thought the Rebbe was saying, oh, how beautiful the waitress is. And he mentioned it to his Rebbe. He said, oh, yes, the waitress is very beautiful. And the Rebbe was very upset because he wasn't looking at women, and he certainly wouldn't have made a statement like that. And so he was offended. And so he let Yeshu know how offended he was. And Yeshu understood that he got confused. He tried to apologize. And the Rebbe was just very upset at him, extremely upset at him. And Yeshu came a few times and he pushed him away. And then the Rebbe decided, okay, I think he's learned his lesson. So Yeshu came again to apologize. But this time the Rebbe was in the middle of prayer. And he made a kind of a motion, like in Israel, this means wait a minute. Like, or please wait a minute. Just wait a minute. I'm in the middle of davening. I'll get you in a minute. Apparently in Italy, if you do that, it means something completely different. But here in Israel, it means like, wait a minute. But Yeshu thought he was pushing him away again. And it says that Yeshu left, and whatever happened in history followed. And so in the Talmud, again, this was censored by the Christian authorities. They took it out of the Talmud. But the sages said, again, look what happened because someone pushed someone away. So these are just two examples where cause and effect. And so here it's just a very, very fine line between what we are causing. Let's take it on an individual level. Just when negativity comes to us. So this is the famous story of the Baal Shem Tov. And this was one of the cardinal teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. One time he was coming home from shul on Shabbat, and he saw two Jews arguing, like very strong, strident kind of arguing. And the Baal Shem Tov looks at this, and his reaction is, what did I do to deserve that I had to see this on Shabbat? In other words, it wasn't like, oh, you guys, get your trip together, or why are you arguing, or whatever. Instead, he put it back on himself. What I must have done something wrong that caused me to have to see this on Shabbat. And so I mentioned this book before. It's a book by Sarah Yehudit Schneider called You Are What You Hate. And she takes these teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, and especially a specific Torah from the Kamarner Rebbe, which, and she includes the entire Torah in Hebrew and English. And basically, the idea is that everything around us is an extension of our own soul. She goes very deep into Kabbalah and Chassidut to show that the different levels of the soul, the nefesh, the ruach, the neshama, the chaya, and the yechida, they're not just in our body. Like we talk about, that every person has a vibrational field. Every entity has a vibrational field. This is actually how gravity works. Gravity works on the gravitational power of mass. And therefore, all the planets go around the sun, because in our planetary system, the sun has the most mass. And as Einstein explained, mass bends space. And in other words, it attracts anything that has less mass. And that's why the Earth goes around the sun, because of the gravitational pull exerted by the sun. So every entity in the world has a vibrational field. And so she's saying that a person's soul extends far beyond them. And that draws good energy, and it can draw the opposite of good energy, depending what energy we're putting out. And so the name of the book is You Are What You Hate. In other words, everything that's happening out there is an extension of what's happening in here. And so this idea of when a person is confronted, here, enemy means to some, let's say someone we're not getting along with. We have to like soften the word enemy here. Someone we're not getting along with. So there's, that person is responsible for their actions, their speech, their thoughts. But we also, on a very, very high ethereal level, have to understand that if I'm jealous of someone, or if I'm angry at someone, or if I don't get along with someone, instead of just placing all the blame on someone else, we need to also look at ourselves. This is a very, very big principle in Chassidut. And so therefore, again, going back to the idea of how careful we have to be with this, that when Israel is confronted by enemies, when an individual is confronted by enemies, we have to just be aware, not that we shouldn't defend ourselves, and not that our enemies are right. That's not the conclusion that we want to come to. Nonetheless, we have to look for what is there possibly wrong with what I'm doing that is also contributing to this situation. And it's not 100% on either side, but it's a very, very important and deep way of understanding confrontations that we might have in this world. And so the Kamarna Rebbe gives over. So what do you do when you have enemies? Well, you have every right to defend yourself. You have every right to try to make the situation better. But the Kamarna Rebbe says an amazing thing. And we've actually mentioned it in the last few classes, is he said you should pray that your enemies, those people you don't get along with, your adversaries, see the light and can change. And then he makes an amazing statement. He says that by praying that they will see the light and they will no longer be your enemy, it can have an effect. And this is taken from another Talmudic story that we mentioned of Rebbe Meir and Bruria. There were thieves terrorizing Rebbe Meir's neighborhood. People came to Rebbe Meir and said, can you please do something? At least pray to get rid of these evildoers. And so he could discuss this with his wife, and he said, I'm going to pray that they're destroyed. And Bruria pointed out that in the 104th Psalm, the last verse is the idea that our hope is there won't be any more evil. Evil will just disappear. So Bruria pointed out, it doesn't say that evil doers will disappear. It says that evil will disappear. So she said, why don't you pray that they do tshuva and that the evil disappears? But it disappears by them doing tshuva, not by them dying. Let them do tshuva. So Rebbe Meir prayed that they did tshuva, and they all did tshuva. So this is an idea that has very wide ramifications. And that is when people are doing things that are wrong. Let's say that it's against the Torah. It's against morality. It's against common sense. It's against ethics. So we have to make a fine line between the action of a person and the person themselves. In other words, we can disagree and be vehemently against certain actions, but it doesn't mean that we have to be vehemently against the people who are doing those things. This is especially when we talk about other Jews. We're all one family. And if someone is doing things that they shouldn't be doing, so we have to divide between, God forbid, hating the person or wanting to take revenge on the person or to wipe the person out. Instead, we want to concentrate on the wrong actions. And I remember really learning this very, very deeply, and I'll attribute it to Rabbi Hillel Goldberg. This was at the time of AIDS. It was at the beginning of AIDS. And at the time, there was really, they didn't have vaccines for it. They didn't have a healing for it. And at least at that time, virtually all people who had AIDS were getting it either through homosexual practices or through needles, through illegal drugs. And it was a very, very big problem there because it was starting to spread to people who didn't do those things. In the beginning, it was more or less in that arena, but then it started spreading through blood. And so I remember he wrote an editorial and like just cautioning everyone that on one hand, we should have compassion. Anyone who had AIDS, we should pray for their healing. We should have compassion for them. But at the same time, it doesn't prevent us for being against the practices that lead to someone getting AIDS. Because you could say, well, we'll lump them all together, the people and their actions. And I remember he wrote this beautiful, beautiful editorial saying, even if we disagree with the actions that are leading them to get AIDS, it shouldn't prevent us from having compassion on someone who is sick. So you hear how subtle this is, but how important it is. So now I want to bring up a point. I'm changing the subject a bit here. It was Hillel Goldberg. He wrote it in the late 80s he is the editor of the IJN, the Intermountain Jewish News. That is the Jewish newspaper for Denver, Colorado. And that's when I was in Denver. So I've always had a question. Maybe you've had the same question. God could make the world any way he wanted to. And it always, I don't know if the word bothered, but it was always a big question, this concept of the survival of the fittest. Why is it, and that's part of evolution, and the concept of the survival of the fittest in its pure sense is not contradictory to the Torah. It's a fact of life. You look out and you see the worms are eating the small insects, and the birds are eating the worms, and the cat comes and eats the bird, and the dog comes and it wants to eat the cat. And if you're out in the jungle, the tiger is going to come and attack the dog. And I always wonder, like, what are we supposed to learn from them? What does it mean that, obviously we have domesticated animals that don't live like that. And of course, those are the only animals we're allowed to eat. And there's a reason for it. But if you look at the world in general, most in the animal kingdom, someone's eating someone for dinner. And I was always wondering, like what to learn from this. And one day to me, it was an epiphany. And that is because we also have an animal soul. And we look around the world and we see in every generation war after war after war over land, over power, over economics, over politics, over religion. And right now, there's so many wars happening now simultaneously that it's incredible. And then there's all these mini revolts happening and revolutions that we don't even make it to the paper. Don't even make it to the paper. And so I just had this idea, because we've been talking about war, the idea of struggle. So here we have the survival of the fittest, that we see that engraved in the way creation kind of was brought into being, is based very much on the survival of the fittest, the strongest. And I realized that we also have an animal soul. And a tiger does exactly what a tiger is supposed to do. We don't make it like a moral judgment of a tiger. The tiger follows its instincts. That's how it was created. The tiger didn't create itself. It was created that way. But a human being has an animal soul, but it also has a divine soul. And what I'm saying is a very simple idea, but it took me a very long time to kind of integrate this idea that what we as human beings need to do is we also have that instinctual drive of the survival of the fittest. You know, you see it a lot in the business world, that the way people will cut each other's throats, not literally, but to make an extra dollar. And, you know, or in a corporation where there's intense competition to get that next level of pay or authority or job description, and the competition, it's like built in, and yet we're meant to transcend it. That is the challenge of human beings, because we have an animal soul, and we could see, like I said, with all the wars that are happening, they're driven by really our lower soul, our lower instincts, our lower behavioristic being. And yet we really need to transcend. And this, of course, will happen at the time of Mashiach. That is going to be the change that is going to happen, is that the basic consciousness of humanity will be able to fix, heal, direct, and uplift the animal soul to be really totally ruled by the more spiritual soul. So this goes so much with what we've been talking about, the idea of war and peace. Well, if you take the concept of war and apply it to what I just tried to explain, so then we see this kind of struggle everywhere. Every animal gets up in the morning and it's like, I need to eat today. I need to eat today. Again, you have domestic animals, and that's why they're the only animals we're allowed to eat, because there's a different instinctual nature there. Any animal that is on the hunt is forbidden for us to eat. So this idea I wanted to mention, because as we move through this and we get into Mashiach and into the changes of consciousness that will happen, this is one of them. This goes with the prophecy of Isaiah, that when Mashiach comes, the lion will lay down with the lamb. And we'll see that the Rambam, so he says this is an allegory, that nature will, at least in the beginning, will not change so radically that a lion will lay down with a lamb. He said Isaiah meant this as an allegory. Others don't agree with Rambam. Others say that no, not just human consciousness, but consciousness in all of creation will change. That we'll get to. Okay, so the truth is, we haven't touched on many of the wars that are mentioned in the Tanach. And to be honest, that wasn't really my intention. But in the Torah itself, we have the war of Amalek. We have the war with Og and Sichon. We have the war at Nachal Zered. Then when we go into the Tanach, all the wars of Yehoshua to conquer the land. And there were many, many wars, a whole generation of wars to conquer the land of Israel. And then in the book of Judges, there is just war after war after war. The war with Sisera, and Devorah sings a song afterwards. There are the wars that Shimshon, Samson fought with the Philistines. There's the wars of Gidon that he fought, of Yiftach that he fought. And then all of the wars of David HaMelech. First of the wars of Shaul. Shaul fought against Amalek. He fought against the Philistines. And then David actually was not, even though it was his vision to build the temple, God said, you can't build the temple. You have too much blood on your hands. David fought war after war after war. The book of Malachim, of Kings, full of wars. The holiday of Purim is not that far off. If you look at the end of the story, there was, even though it lasted just 2 days, it was a 2-day, we had the 6-day war in 1967. At Purim, there was a 2-day war, but it was a real war. And Megillah actually said that 75,000 people died. It was, like I said, it lasted 2 days, but it also was a war. And so my intention wasn't to go into each one of the wars and discuss the details. All the time was more the global concepts of war and peace. But I do want to do a few here, and that is from Parshat Balak. And at the end of Balak, if you remember, Balak hires Bilam to curse the Jews. Bilam was considered equal to Moshe in prophecy, but from the other side, from the side of magic and sorcery and impurity. Of course, it's a great mystery how someone with these powers could be so corrupt. That's a different subject. But after, and Bilam very much wanted to curse the Jews, but he had prophetic powers, and he understood that God was not allowing him to curse the Jews. So at the end, he says a number of parables. All of his attempts, to curse the Jews were given over in parable form. And so at the end, if anyone wants to follow, it's chapter 24 of the book of Bamidbar. And the amazing thing is that these are some of the clearest prophecies of the coming of Mashiach and the end of days. We're going to be moving into that. That's why I wanted to quote this. So I'll read it in English. It's verse 17, chapter 24 of Bamidbar. It says, I shall see him, but not now. I shall look at him, but it is not near. A star has issued from Jacob, and a scepter bearer has risen from Israel. and he shall pierce the nobles of Moab and undermine the children of Seth. Now this, we're going to get to it next week. Rambam quotes this in his discussion of Mashiach. And he says clearly, Bilam saw in the future the coming of Mashiach, and he was right. He said, I see it, but not now. I see it, but it's not near. And then the idea, a star will come out of Yaakov. So this star is the reason that Rabbi Akiva named Bar Koziba Bar Kochba, because in Hebrew, a kochav is a star. So Rabbi Akiva, at least for a while, thought that Bar Kochba, I rather put it this way, potentially could have been the Mashiach. And so he named him Bar Kochba, the son of the star, based on this prophecy. And then he says, what will happen? He will pierce the nobles of Moab and undermine the children of Seth. This starts to describe what are called the final wars before Mashiach comes. And then he says, Edom shall be a conquest. In other words, this figure, now remember, Edom is Esav. Esav is Rome. Rome became Christianity. Edom shall be a conquest in Seir. That's where Esav went to dwell. Shall be the conquest of his enemies, and Israel will attain success. Here he's mentioning that what we'll call in the end of days, there will be battles, there'll be wars, and part of Mashiach coming will be the victory in these wars. I'm not going to read all of it, but then he says he saw Amalek, and he declaimed his parable and said, Amalek is the first among nations, meaning he was the first of the nations to come and fight against Israel, but its end will be eternal destruction. Here again, he's prophesying that the energy and the evil of Amalek will be wiped out at that time. Okay, then he goes on and he mentions Assyria, he mentions the Canaanite, he mentions Kittim. But the idea, what I wanted to say, because later, and we're going to get to it in a few minutes, we have the description in a number of the different prophets of what are called the last wars. And so when we look at the last wars, the name that is usually associated with it are called the wars of Gog and Magog. And the interesting thing is, in all of the prophecies, and I'm going to mention some now, if anyone wants to write these down, in the book of Ezekiel, so chapters 38 and 39 are very, very specific about these wars. In Zechariah, chapters 13 and 14, Yirmiyahu, chapter 30, a little bit less. When I went through it, it was a little bit harder to see the specifics that Yirmiyahu was talking about. In the book of Daniel, 11 and 12, chapters 11 and 12 are about these final wars. In Yoel, chapter 4, very specific. But what's interesting is the only one that gives the name of Gog and Magog is in Yechezkel, Ezekiel. He's the only one who actually mentions the name Gog and Magog. And there it's very clear that Gog is the name of the ruler of the place called Magog. Because when you say Gog or Magog, it sounds like two people. But what it really means is Gog, the ruler of the place called Magog. And in especially Yechezkel, Zechariah, Daniel, and Yoel, they're very, very similar. And then in other prophecies of Yirmiyahu, of Yeshayahu, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, there's also these predictions of horrific events that could possibly happen. And that's why I want to say here very, very strongly, could happen. We know there's a general principle of prophecy. Any good prophecy has to happen, will happen. That's why, and it's important to state, right now, the good prophecies are all, now I wouldn't say all, are happening almost starting in the Torah itself, in Parshat Nitzavim. In Parshat Nitzavim, this is almost the kernel of all of the prophecies in the book of the prophets. It's already in the Torah, in Parshat Nitzavim, the book of Devarim, in chapter 30. And I want to read this. This is one of the most important passages because this is the basis of what's happening right now. Now, this is in the middle of the parsha, and the rest of the parsha is talking about the long and cruel exile that the Jewish people will experience. The Torah is just telling us very clearly what will happen, even though technically it didn't have to happen. That's a great paradox here, because throughout the book of Devarim, it's if you do right, blessing. You do wrong, curses. Blessings, curses, blessing, curses. And then God says, I place before you today life and death, good and evil. Ubecharta b'chaim, and choose life. In other words, we have free choice. But the mystery here is that in the song of Ha'azinu, so and in the final chapters of Devarim, God says to Moshe, now I'm going to tell you what is going to happen. And so, yes, we do have free choice at every minute, at every second. And yet the Torah is also a prophetic book. And it says, I will tell you what will happen. You know, this reminds me, I think David is here. In the Sunday class, we were talking about, it started with this implant from Elon Musk, hoping to help people who are who don't have the ability to walk anymore to be able to walk again. And David pointed out that, like everything in life, You can use it for the good, or you can use it to the bad. But when you look at the history of mankind, David was saying it's virtually guaranteed that someone along the line is going to use this in not a positive way. And so here again, it could go either way, but the weight of history. Anyways, I want to read this. This is one of the most important passages in the entire Torah. It will be that when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse that I have presented before you, then you will take it to your heart among all the nations where Hashem your God has dispersed you. This is the exile to the four corners of the earth that most certainly happened. And you will return unto Hashem your God and listen to his voice according to everything that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul. Then Hashem your God will bring back your captivity and have mercy upon you, and he will gather you in from all the peoples to which Hashem your God has scattered you. If you're dispersed, will be at the ends of heaven. From there Hashem your God will gather you in, and from there he will take you. Hashem your God will bring you to the land that your forefathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will do good to you and make you more numerous than your forefathers. Hashem your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring to love Hashem your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. This is such an important prophecy, because all the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Micha, all of them, they didn't base it. God revealed to them the same idea of exile and redemption, of good and evil, of blessing and curse, and that in the end, after all that has happened, God will gather us from the four corners of the world, will bring us back to Israel. We will rebuild the cities. The Yerushalayim will become the spiritual capital of the world again. The land will turn green and will be like a Garden of Eden. All of that was predicted, and all of that has happened in the last 100 years and is happening. There's only one thing left: Mashiach. And they all predicted that there will be a Redeemer and there will be a redemption. So, very simply, if all the other prophecies, the good prophecies, were predicted and are coming true, then why should we have any doubt that Mashiach will come, redemption will come, and peace will come to the world? As far as the idea of these horrendous last wars, they don't have to happen. They don't have to happen. But many people have predicted the wars of the last 100 years as, yes, they are happening. World War I, World War II, 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1981, 1990, 2001, 2006, 2014, 2019, 2023-24. So it's hard to say that they're not happening. It's just like war after war after war. The miracle is Remember what it says in when we went down to Egypt. The more they oppressed us, the more we multiplied, and the stronger that we got. The miracle is that Israel at 75 has become the incredible country it has, despite all those wars I just mentioned. Despite all of that, what we've accomplished is beyond nature. It's totally beyond nature. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit longer than usual today, because I want to say just a little bit more about Gog and Magog, and we'll save Mashiach for next week. So we're going to learn the Rambam. And the Rambam makes a very important statement. He said, and I'm just paraphrasing, says, we have a tradition that a Redeemer will come. We have a tradition, more or less, what he will accomplish. But the Rambam says, no one knows exactly until it happens, and that trying to predict exactly when Mashiach will come and how he will come and who he will be and what the circumstance will be, he said, we won't know until it happens. And so it's the same thing with these wars of Gog and Magog. There are many different versions of how these wars will play themselves out, how they will begin, how they will end. So I just suggest the sources that I gave you are the main sources in Ezekiel and Zechariah especially. Now, one of the parts of chapters 13 and 14, chapter 14 in Zechariah is the Haftorah for the first day of Sukkot. It's the first day of Sukkot. The other ones aren't Haftorahs. But on Sukkot, we read Zechariah's prophecy of these last wars. And so therefore, chapter 14 in Zechariah is very important. And the reason we read it on Sukkot is, he says, after these wars, whoever is left will come up to Jerusalem for the holiday of Sukkot. And that's why it's the Haftorah of Sukkot. And so here we have a tremendous paradox, because in our tradition, it's called Sukkot Shalom, a sukkah of peace. Ufros Aleinu, Sukkot Shlomecha, put over us a sukkah of peace. We say this all the time. The idea in the evening prayers, the idea of a sukkah of peace. And yet, the Haftorah for Sukkot is like the most tremendous war. But what we've been saying all along, that there is an intrinsic connection between war and peace on a personal level. If you remember, the verse that we've quoted over and over again is Hashem oz li'amo yitain, Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. God will give strength to his people to be able to survive all these wars, to be able to survive all of the oppression that we've gone through, all of everything. And then God will grant us with peace. So the wars of Gog and Magog they don't have to play themselves out as written, but it certainly appears that the concept of wars before the final redemption is somehow encoded in reality. Just like there had to be 10 plagues before we could come out of Egypt. And also, I mentioned before the war of Sisera that Devorah fought, and then she sang her song. And actually, I wrote to Devorah and Randy today about, if you saw in the email, maybe not yet, about the song of Devorah. So afterwards, it says, and then there was peace for, after Devorah, I can't remember, it was 40 years or 80 years. In the book of Judges, 3-4 times at least, there would be a war. And then it says, and then there was peace for 40 years, or once it was for 80 years. 80 years, like, that would be like a dream. That would be like a dream. Anyways, I just want to say that all of these prophecies that I mentioned have one thing in common, that, and again, I don't know if all means literally all, but it says all the nations of the world will come against Israel. All of the nations. And Gog will be instrumental in making this coalition to come against Israel. And it's mentioned in Yechezkel and in Zechariah, this idea of everyone coming against Israel. And of course, it wouldn't be the first time. I remember this, because actually I saw him say this. Everyone knows in 1981, we attacked the atomic reactor in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was secretly trying to build nuclear weapons, and Israel attacked the reactor. Later, most people don't know, we did the same thing in Syria, just maybe 15 years ago. But it was in 1981. The entire world condemned Israel. The United States cut off aid to Israel for 6 months. Everyone across the board, with no exceptions, came against Israel. I'll never forget Menachem Begin, who, when he was an orator. And again, I'm paraphrasing. He said, everyone knows why they were building this reactor. Everyone knows that Iraq wants to destroy Israel. He said, this is post-Holocaust. He said, never again. And in all practical purposes, he said, the whole world, you can all go hang yourself. We did what we had to do, and you can all go hang yourself. I remember, like, whoa, whoa. But that was one of the things. Right now, there are countries that somewhat support Israel and what they're doing, but it's pretty half-hearted. The whole rest of the world, ceasefire, 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 leave Hamas in power, leave Hamas in power. War crimes, war crimes, war crimes, genocide, genocide, genocide. Even the ones that are supporting us, and appreciative, and we should be appreciative for that support. It is important support, but there's all this back pressure on Israel not to win again. It's like, it's very blatant. The world doesn't allow Israel to win. It doesn't allow Israel to win. So in that case, we can't say the whole world right now in a certain way. Anyways, so let's hope we've seen the worst of it. I've heard many rabbis say it's like, it happened already. It happened already. We're just in the tail end. It doesn't have to get worse. Let's hope for the best. All the good prophecies will happen. They're guaranteed to happen. We just, like the Rambam says, we just don't know when and how. But we have to have faith. And that's what we're going to pick up next week. The Rambam's 12th principle of faith in the coming of Mashiach. And that's what we'll pick up next week. Maybe between now and next week, we'll see the miracles that we're hoping for. Yeah, we discussed this a couple of times. I'm just really, really davening for miracles. We need, like, it's 3.5 months and we can't find the hostages. And I can guarantee you the army, the Mossad, they 24/7, they are trying. And we're trying to get to their leadership, because if we could get rid of their leadership, Hamas really might fall apart. We've accomplished a tremendous amount at a very high cost, but Rabbanu Sha'olam, please help us. Rabbanu Sha'olam, please help us.